So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, a notorious transatlantic murder mystery. And I should note that, as always, this video is based on original scripts submitted to us by a member of our writing team, that being Radu Alexander. Follow them on the social media links below if they provide them for us. Otherwise, let's get to it. At his trial, Hawley Harvey Crippen was described as one of the most dangerous and remarkable men to have lived this century, and a compelling and masterful personality who feared neither God nor man. The people who knew Crippen, though, described him in a completely different way. They referred to Crippen as being as docile as a kitten, a humble, unassuming little man you would not have believed could kill a mouse. Those were the two opposites of Dr. Crippen, a man who appeared to be a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So which of these two men was Crippen? Was he the cunning and remorseless psychopath who successfully donned the guise of a gentle, henpecked husband and fooled all those around him? Or was he truly innocent and himself became the victim of a miscarriage of justice? Well, why don't you ruminate about that as we discuss his life? Hawley Harvey Crippen was born on September 11th, 1862 in Coldwater, Michigan, the only child of a man named Myron Augustus Crippen and his wife Andressa Skinner. Young Hawley grew up in a privileged household. His grandfather, Felio Crippen, was a pioneer who settled in Coldwater back when it was just a handful of log cabins. But being situated at the junction between the Coldwater River and the Chicago Turnpike, the little settlement saw a lot of activity from loggers and fur trappers who passed that way to reach the northern woods. Felio opened a general store to supply all the passers-by, and it quickly flourished. By the time Hawley's father, Myron, inherited the business, the Crippens were already prosperous and lived in the biggest house in town. Despite the store being responsible for the family's affluence, Hawley had no desire to take it over when he was old enough. Instead, from a young age, he looked up to his uncle Bradley, who served as the family doctor for pretty much all of Coldwater. It wasn't much of a surprise then that when he grew up, Hawley Crippen studied medicine. Well, sort of. He studied homeopathy, first in his native Michigan and then in London for a spell, and finally graduated from the Homeopathic Hospital College in Cleveland, Ohio in 1884. After graduation, it was time for Dr. Crippen to find himself a job. He worked in Detroit for a spell, working as an assistant to a Dr. Porter before going to New York, where he studied another year at the ophthalmic hospital and emerged qualified as an ear and eye specialist. During that time, he met and fell in love with another student named Charlotte Jane Bell, and the couple got married in December 1887. The following year, the doc and his new wife moved to San Diego, California, where he opened his practice. This was pretty close to Crippen's parents, who'd relocated to California in Los Angeles during the 1870s, but the move was not permanent. For whatever reason, Crippen just did not seem to be the kind of guy to stay in one place for too long, and just a few years later, he left San Diego and went to Salt Lake City, Utah. By that point, Charlotte had given birth to their son, Hawley Otto, and was already pregnant with their second child when she died suddenly of apoplexy. And there was never any reason to suspect that her death was anything but natural, but given who her husband was and later what he became infamous for, it was natural for people to assume that maybe her husband had, helped shuffle her off this mortal coil. Now a widower with a 3-year-old son, Crippen resorted to his default course of action: moving away. Feeling that he was more of a career guy than a parental type, he sent his kid off to live with his parents and moved to New York City, where he became a doctor's assistant and also met the first woman who would change his life forever. So I'm interrupting this video with a message from today's sponsor, but don't worry, because I'm talking about the sponsor, that means we get an appearance from Business Anteater. I am so happy that we decided to just make this stuffed anteater a mascot for the sponsorships, because I really like just petting this anteater. It's a very soothing thing. But today's sponsor is NordVPN, and I'd like to open with a story. Are you ready, Brad and Nisha? People wondering, Brad and Nisha, who are these guys? Like, you work behind the scenes, right?
We do.
You do, yes. So you're in here behind the scenes to help me tell the audience today about today's sponsor, and I've got a story. So it's getting near Christmas, isn't it? And I've ordered a lot of presents from, are we allowed to say the name? Like, that company that sells everything now. And like many people, my email inbox was just cluttered with messages like, this thing's been delivered, this thing's been delivered. Yeah, I know, I'm in. I've never not been more in. And then I noticed a text message that said, we missed your delivery today. And I was like, okay, well, I was in, the most in I've ever been ever, but maybe I did miss something because I've got a lot of stuff on order. And when I clicked that, I did the thing that you're supposed to do when you see something like that. You click where the email was from, and it wasn't from the big company that owns everything. It was from bunch of numbers at whogivesahell.com. And I realized that's a phishing scam. And I'd like to consider myself, like, a seasoned user of the internet, and I almost fell for that. Thankfully, if, you want to avoid stuff like this, you want peace of mind, NordVPN is there to help you out. So tell me more about our sponsor today, NordVPN, as I flick my snoot.
So if people are unaware, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network.
I've always wondered that. I've actually never looked this up. Because I think VPN is just a word, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's Virtual Private Network. That makes so much sense. And what does a virtual private network do when it's at home? So
basically it hides your online activity.
And here's the thing though, like, how many devices can I protect at once?
6 devices.
Okay, so I'm like an online content creator, so I'm like a very edge use case. Let's see how many devices I have within reach right now. So I've got my laptop, I have my phone, I have my work computer, I have my other laptops in the other room, so that's 4, because I've got a home laptop as well. I have my non-business phone, so that's 5, and then I've got my other editing PC. So
that's 6.
That's 6. I could protect all of my devices, and I'm like a very edge use case. So even in like the most extreme cases, someone with so many devices, all of them would be protected.
Yeah. One of the good features about NordVPN as well is their threat protection.
Yes, because when you're online, you're constantly being threatened. Oh, you mean abstract? Okay.
It blocks trackers, malware.
Oh, I think it just blocks like weirdos on Twitter from telling me to. It's the threat tracker. Just this little.
And also it scans files that you're downloading to make sure they're safe.
Which is exceptionally useful in this day and age, given that virtually all business is conducted online now, or at least it should be, because it's easier and safer for everybody. But downloading mass amounts of files always leaves you open to attack of some kind, and the fact that you can have, again, that peace of mind. Check out NordVPN and get a 4-month extra on a 2-year plan by going to www.nordvpn.com/bio. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. Hey, that rhymes. Back in the Big Apple, Crippen found work with a certain Dr. Jeffrey, and it was in his office that Crippen first laid eyes on a 19-year-old woman named Cora Turner. Cora's real name was Kunigunde Makamotsky, the daughter of a Russian-Polish father and a German mother, but she had aspirations of becoming a big singing star, so obviously she needed a catchier stage name that was easier to say and pronounce and spell. So later on she'll perform under the name Belle Elmore, but we'll just keep calling her Cora for the sake of simplicity. Crippen fell for her the moment he saw her, but he had some competition. At the time, Cora Turner was the mistress of a married stove manufacturer named Lincoln, who had rented an apartment for her and was paying for her expenses and even some singing lessons, which, as you're about to learn, she sorely needed. This Lincoln guy had a lot to offer Cora, but there was one thing he couldn't give her: a wedding ring, and that's where Crippen had the advantage. He certainly wasn't shy about his feelings for Cora, and the two started spending some time together. One day, Cora informed him that Lincoln wanted her to go away with him. Now, whether or not this was true, we cannot say, but it had the desired effect on Crippen, who proposed to her on the spot. They tied the knot on September 1st, 1892. Unfortunately, the couple was not headed for marital bliss. Shortly after the wedding, Cora had a medical emergency that required a oophorectomy, aka the removal of her ovaries. This left her barren, which immediately put a great strain on their relationship since both of them wanted children. More relevant to the later murder investigation, though, is that it also left her with a very distinct scar, but more on that later. For now, though, Crippen was a happily married man with a blushing bride, and like Lincoln before him, he kept paying for music lessons for Cora in the hopes that one day she might make it big. However, deep down it's likely that Crippen knew the truth. His wife just wasn't that talented. Sure, she made some waves of the church choir, but that wasn't enough to get her on the big stage, especially now she set her sights on becoming an opera singer. To make matters worse, Crippen was affected by the economic depression known as the Panic of 1893, and he had to close his medical practice and move in with Cora's parents. And maybe he was just a crap doctor. We'll never know. He did study homeopathy to start with. So either way, he found a new and better job selling patent medicines for a business named Munyon's, one of the biggest homeopathic companies in the country. Even after the American government passed the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and tested some of Munyon's products and showed that, like almost all quack remedies, they mainly consisted of water, oils, and whatever else they found in their cupboards that day, the company still bizarrely remained profitable. Crippen and company boss James Munyon had a good working relationship for most of their adult lives. In fact, years later, when Crippen was on trial for murder, Munyon offered a large reward to anyone who could prove that Cora Turner was still alive. But for the time being, Munyon transferred Crippen to Philadelphia, then to Toronto, then back to Philly to manage the offices there. Then in 1897, Munyon decided it was time to expand across the pond and sent Crippen to London to manage a new branch over there in jolly old England. Initially, Crippen travelled to London alone. Cora was understandably getting a little sick of all the moving around and the negative impact it had on her theoretical musical career. However, after a few months, she did join her husband in London with a new goal. She'd abandoned her dream of becoming an opera singer in favour of a music hall singer, something which was a bit more within the realms of possibility. And in England, Cora possessed a quality she didn't have back home. She was exotic. Her American accent, which was quite en vogue at the time, immediately gave her an edge over other performers, even if her singing wasn't up to snuff. Already, Cora was suffering from delusions of grandeur and saw herself topping bills on London's West End, but her debut was a bit of a reality check. She wasn't on the West End, but at the old Marylebone Music Hall in a mini operetta called The Unknown Quantity. Opening night was a disaster where the audience mostly sat on their hands while Cora sang her little heart out. The theatre gave her a week's run, but afterwards decided not to renew her contract. This was a humiliating blow for Cora, who placed most of the blame on her husband. Well, it is true that initially Crippen was against his wife performing in music halls, but eventually he did relent and even acted as their manager for a spell. And we're not sure if he actually did anything, but he's listed as Cora's manager in a playbill, which actually landed him in hot water with his boss back in America. You see, in 1899, Crippen was called back to America by Munyon, who'd got his hands on one of those playbills and fired him because he was concerned he was spending too much time managing his wife's floundering career. He also didn't want his very legitimate business to be associated with the seedy underworld of music hall performance. You know, his business selling quack remedies and snake oils to unsuspecting customers. Once he returned to London, Crippen had to look for another job. He didn't have the qualifications to practice medicine in England, so instead he acted as a consultant or manager to various businesses that sold the same kind of basic quack remedies as Munyon had, although none of these jobs lasted particularly long, and neither did the businesses themselves for that matter, because again, they were selling stuff that didn't work, and it's real hard to stay in business when your product doesn't work. At the same time, Crippen had to deal with a growing rift between him and his wife. At one point, she told him straight up that she didn't care for him anymore and that she'd begun an affair with an ex-boxer turned vaudeville performer named Bruce Miller. At this point, Crippen had already accepted the role of the henpecked husband, so he predictably did what Cora expected him to do. Absolutely nothing. He carried on just like before, at least until he met a second woman who would change his life forever. In 1902, Crippen was working as a consulting physician at the Dulwich Institute for the Deaf. And don't let that fancy name fool you, it was nothing more than a flim-flam designed to grift money out of people by selling quack remedies by mail for various ear ailments. Crippen was only there for a couple of years, but it was enough time for him to meet Ethel Clara LeNave, a 17-year-old typist who worked at the Institute alongside her sister, Nina. Eventually, Nina left to get married, and Ethel climbed up the ranks a bit until she became Crippen's personal secretary. Ethel looked at Crippen in a way that his wife had not done in years, with adoration, even worship. Sure, this was because she was still young and innocent, but to her, Crippen was a fancy doctor and a distinguished older gentleman at that. Pretty much the complete opposite of her own father, a no-good drunken lout. For his part, Crippen too reciprocated the affection and admiration he received from Ethel, since he wasn't getting it at home, in the both metaphorical and literal sense. Unsurprisingly, their feelings of platonic fondness for each other turned into feelings of not so platonic fondness, and Crippen resorted to the biggest cliche in the book. He began an affair with his own secretary. By this point, husband and wife now merely tolerated one another's presence as they both carried on liaisons with other people. Cora was too concerned with her own life to care about what Crippen was doing. Career-wise, she never made it to the top. It's not like she could just magically become an amazing singer overnight, but if she couldn't make it through the front door of the entertainment world, she could wiggle her way through a narrow side passage. So the one thing Cora was good at was social mixing. Even her limited standing in the music hall business got her invites to a few fancy parties, and there she met and befriended some pretty big names, such as Marie Lloyd and Lil Hawthorne. Before you knew it, Cora was part of their inner circle and was named the fundraiser for the Music Hall Ladies Guild. And this was really the perfect position for Cora, since it allowed her to pretend that she was a much bigger star than she truly was, thus balancing the grandness of her dreams and ambition with the harsh realities of her mediocre talent. This was how the arrangement went on for a few years, but things changed in 1909. It could be because Crippen's finances were hanging by a thread between keeping two women, one of whom had pretty expensive tastes in furs and diamonds, and investing in a floundering dental remedy business called Yale Tooth Specialists. Crippen was flirting with bankruptcy, to say the least. And it could be because Ethel was getting sick of being the mistress of a married man and she wanted more for herself, and she even used a friendship with a co-lodger named John Stonehouse to show the doctor that she had other options. This prompted the response she wanted from Crippen, who showed up with a diamond ring and presumably a firmer commitment to their relationship. Or it could also have been because Ethel got pregnant with Crippen's child and suffered a miscarriage. Cora found out about this and started spreading rumours that Ethel had had an abortion because she couldn't tell which one of her many lovers was the father. Crippen could handle all the abuse aimed at him without flinching, but he would not allow the name of the woman he loved to be besmirched. Or it could be a combination of all three reasons. Whatever motivated Crippen, he finally decided it was time to take drastic action. On Monday, January 31st, Paul and Clara Martinetti joined the Crippens for dinner and a game of whist. This was done at the assistance of Dr. Crippen himself, who called on his friends 2 times during that day to make sure that they would come. The Martinettis retired at around 1:30 in the morning, leaving Cora and the doctor alone in their house at number 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Cora Crippen was never heard or seen again. A few days later, Crippen tendered his wife's resignation from the Music Hall Ladies Guild and started parading around town with Ethel. Cora's showbiz friends got suspicious, especially when they noticed that Ethel was wearing some of Cora's diamonds, and they knew that Cora loved her diamonds a lot more than she loved her husband, and that she would never leave them behind. And when they asked for an explanation, Crippen simply stated that his wife had left suddenly for America and she wasn't coming back. Pressed for details, he became evasive, which only increased their suspicion. Lil Hawthorne and her husband, John Nash, were convinced that something was amiss, and they travelled all the way to New York to find Cora. There, they received a letter from England which said that, according to Crippen, his wife had died in Los Angeles of pneumonia. This wasn't a very well thought out lie from the doctor. Obviously, if the couple sailed across the ocean to ask about Cora, they're not going to skimp out on a long distance phone call. So they called the police in Los Angeles and were told that nobody by the name of Cora Crippen, Cora Turner, Belle Elmore, or even, and this is my favourite word I've said during this video, Kunigunde Makamotsky had died there, and that settled it. The couple returned to London, and Nash scheduled an appointment with a friend of his at Scotland Yard and informed him that they believed that Dr. Crippen had murdered his wife. Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to the case. Crippen had a better story lined up for the detective. He confessed that he'd lied to his wife's friends. He did not want to admit the humiliating truth that his wife had left him for another man. Crippen went into detail about their unhappy marriage, the affairs, hoping to admit just enough wrongdoings to make himself out to be a bit of a scoundrel, but not a murderer. He then said that as far as he knew, Cora was alive and well, presumably having travelled to Chicago to rekindle her romance with Bruce Miller, who went there a few years earlier. Crippen even allowed the police to take a look around his home and see that everything was fine. Dew left the house not completely free of suspicion, but not at all convinced that he was dealing with a killer. And at this point, Crippen might have gotten away with it if he played cool, but he wasn't really the cool type, was it? As we've discussed while mentioning his backstory, he was more of a panic and do something stupid type. And when Dew returned the following Monday for a follow-up interview, he discovered that Crippen and Ethel Leneve had flown the coop during the weekend. So he'd done what he always did and ran away. And this is what a seasoned detective like Walter Dew would refer to as suspicious behaviour. The police decided to take a closer look at the house, 39 Hilldrop Crescent. First they dug up the garden and then the coal cellar, where they struck pay dirt. And by pay dirt we mean the decomposing torso of a woman who'd been murdered. After his initial interview with the police, Crippen didn't think he had them fooled, so he and Ethel quickly set sail for Brussels, intending to plan their next move there. Meanwhile, the body had been found, and all of England was in shock over the gruesome death, the newspapers branding Dr. Crippen as the London cellar murderer. And clearly they didn't have any good headline writers in that day. Following the discovery of what was left of the body, a team of London's top pathologists and toxicologists worked out that the torso belonged to a plump woman who regularly bleached her hair. This fitted Cora Crippen's description. They also discovered a scar on the lower abdomen in the same place Cora had had her operectomy. The cause of death was hyoscine poisoning, a drug that Crippen had purchased a few weeks earlier, even though it wasn't part of his regular orders for his homeopathic remedies. All the fingers were starting to point at the doctor, and there was just one thing left to do: catch him. So meanwhile, Crippen had decided on his course of action. He and Ethel would go to Antwerp, where they would board the Montrose and travel to Canada. They would both disguise themselves, with Ethel donning the outfit of a young boy. Unfortunately for the fleeing couple, their get-ups were not good enough to fool the captain of the ship, Henry George Kendall. Just before setting off on the trip, he had read a description of Crippen and Ethel in a newspaper which speculated that Ethel might try passing herself off as a young boy. Since the Montrose was a repurposed cargo vessel, it didn't have that many passengers, so the couple stood out from the start. As a result, Kendall had his telegraph operator send the following message to England, and I quote, "Have strong suspicion that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are amongst the saloon passengers. Mustache shaved off, growing beard, accomplice dressed as a boy. Voice, manner and build, undoubtedly girl. Once he got the message, Do set sail from Liverpool aboard the Laurentic, a faster ocean liner that got him to Canada before the Montrose. And on July 31st, the Montrose had stopped in St. Lawrence, where the detective boarded the vessel disguised as a pilot. He approached Crippen, who reacted quite placidly and made no attempts to escape. He only stressed that Ethel knew nothing about it and allowed himself to be taken into custody, thus marking a significant and curious landmark in criminal history, this being the first time that wireless telegraphy was used to catch a killer. The trial was, to put it lightly, a media circus, but a short one at that. After 5 days of testimony, the jury found Crippen guilty in just 27 minutes of deliberations, and the judge sentenced him to death. And what made things curious is that Crippen refused to plead guilty, but at the same time offered little resistance or explanations for his actions, even refusing certain strategies pitched by his defence team because they would implicate Ethel and Eve. If that was truly his greatest concern, then Crippen got his wish. Ethel was cleared of all charges, she moved around for a bit and then simply faded into obscurity after a brief date with infamy. Dr. Crippen protested his innocence to the end, that being November 23rd, 1910, when he was hanged from the gallows at Pentonville Prison, and thus ended one of the most notorious murder cases in British history, although maybe not quite. In recent decades, there has been renewed doubt cast over Crippen's guilt. Some say that the scar on the torso, which is the key piece of evidence that implicated Crippen during the trial, was actually just a skin fold. Others argue that if Crippen truly did murder and mutilate his wife, he could have gotten rid of the torso the same way he disposed of the head and limbs, which were never found. So for anyone curious, like, they found a torso, well, the head? No, none of that was found, just the torso. So it's argued that, well, if he managed to dispose of those so thoroughly that they were never found, surely he would have done the same thing with the torso rather than just bury it in his basement. And then you have an American team of scientists who claimed in 2007 that DNA from the torso did not match that of Cora's distant relatives, although not everyone is buying their story. So far, the Criminal Case Review Commission has refused to reopen the case despite repeated calls to do so. But who knows what might happen in the future? It is possible that one of Britain's most infamous killers could be exonerated, although that's a story for another time. So I hope you found this episode of Biographics informative. I certainly did while reading through the script. And if you've got any comments or feedback or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments below. In particular, we'd like to know if there's any other people you'd like us to cover on Biographics, because there's plenty of people out there who've lived fascinating lives that we've not gotten around to yet, and our writers could do with a little push in the direction of those people. So if you've got any examples, ideas, stuff like that, leave them below in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. If you like the video, leave a like, and as always, I'd like to wish everybody out there the day that they deserve. And I think I've been saying that in enough videos now where I can talk about the origins of it, because I've started to notice that people say it to me now on social media and stuff like that, so it's nice to see that it's spreading. It's not something I came up with on my own. It was a friend of mine used to work in a store. He was doing customer service, and he had a bad day, as I think anyone who's worked in customer service can relate to. And he was a bit snippy with an older West Indian lady. And rather than get annoyed with him, she took her product, she just looked him in the eye and just said, "Thank you, young man. Have the day that you deserve." And walked out. And he said just in that moment, hearing that made him completely change his entire attitude. So while interacting with people the rest of the day, and just really took it on board. And I just really like that thought of telling people, you have the day that you deserve. So I've always liked that as a sign off. So I adopted it for these videos, which I hope people appreciate, or at least take on board like I did, because it's just, it's nice. So yeah, go out there and do that. Cheers, everybody.